Hello, everyone, and welcome to Azad. At Azad, we bring together different perspectives in order to better understand what's happening around the world and in Iran. In today's episode, we are discussing the past, present, and future of Iran-US relations after two rounds of war. Today, I'm honored to host two distinguished guests. Dr. Foad Izadi is a professor of American Studies at the University of Tehran. His work focuses on Iran-US relations and American foreign policy. On the other side, Dr. Takeyh is a senior fellow at the Council on Foreign Relations and a scholar of history of Iran-US relations and US policy toward Iran. Mr. Izadi, Mr. Takeyh, thank you for joining us today. Mr. Takeyh,
Thank you.
Let me begin with you. As my first question about the origins and history of the conflict. When did the conflict between Iran and the United States start? And in your opinion, what were its historical causes?
The conflict, as we understand it today, I suspect it began in the post-revolutionary period, in the aftermath of success of the 1979 revolution. And the first episode between the two countries, or at least the one that has most directly affected the American imagination, is the hostage crisis, which began in November 1979, and it lasted for 444 days. That actually became a very searing impression in the American imagination. And it was 47 years ago, maybe longer, but nevertheless, it has affected the mindset of a certain percentage of Americans, particularly those who lived through those times. I suspect a lot of the new generation is not aware of it. And then it has been built up to other episodes that reinforced that. Obviously, I mean, the Iranian perspective will be articulated in a minute. The Iranian perspective probably has to do with the American support for the monarchical regime, the 1953 episode, the 1953 coup that displaced Prime Minister Mohammad Mossadegh, and the close intimacy between the United States and the former monarchical regime. So the Iranian imagination would be different. But that's where it began. And since then, Iran has had a way of injecting itself or being injected into the American political process. I don't think Jimmy Carter lost the 1980 election because of the Iran hostage crisis, but it certainly didn't help. And the Reagan presidency was subsequently damaged because of the episode of Iran-Contra. And of course, you come to the controversy and a divisive debate regarding the arms control agreement between the two sides in 2015 and the wars that have taken place in June 2025 and then again in February 2026. So the historical foundation of it actually go back to that period. I think from the American perspective, it will be the hostage crisis. And I also think for many people who remember those times or perhaps lived through those times, there has been no expression of Iranian contrition over taking over the embassy. And many of the people who were involved in that particular affair, many of them are still here, still in Iran, have not expressed any regret. To my knowledge, and my knowledge may be a limited one in this case, no Iranian official has, or unofficial, or anybody involved in that period has looked at that episode as a breach of international law and a grave transgression. So the lingering effect of that, I think, has colored it. To some extent, there is obviously a misapprehension of Iran. I tend to believe that the Americans, including myself, don't fully understand what is taking place in Iran. The two societies have been estranged from one another. There's not academic visits. There's not that kind of exchange that existed before 79 and existed for a period of time sporadically in the aftermath of that. And therefore, it becomes the black box that is the Iranian politics from the perspective of outsiders becomes even darker because of lack of access to the country. It is my opinion that in Islamic Republic of Iran today, research is equated with espionage. So when people come in, whether it's reporters or others, they tend to find in a hospitable setting. I think it's fair to say, and I don't think I'm exaggerating, that I probably would not be welcomed in Tehran, and that it wouldn't end well for me if I was landing in what we used to call Mehrabad. I don't know what this. I guess there's a larger international airport today. That estrangement has not served either country well because they tend to view each other in caricatures as opposed to real country. For most Americans, Iran is not a country of 85, 90 million people with a lot of diversity of views, but it's a sort of a collection of centrifuges existing in a vacuum. There's a lack of familiarity and access to the country. And I think that's been disadvantageous in terms of understanding the country and appreciating its profound complexity. For most American scholars today looking at Iran, it's a collection of websites. They read the Takeyh website, they read that website, so they don't know the people directly. I always say, for instance, it was discussed around the late Ali Larjani and Saeed Jalili had differences with each other. For most Americans looking at this, those differences were viewed as political differences, perhaps ideological differences. Maybe they just didn't like each other as human beings. The point I'm trying to make is most of the people living outside Iran, particularly in Americans, don't know the Iranians, officials in particular, as human beings. They don't have any interactions with them. And that has been very disadvantageous in understanding the country. And I'm sure it's the way the other side as well.
Mr. Izadi, what's your take?
I generally agree. We, of course, should not forget the 1953 coup. The coup for the United States was not very significant. That's why many people may not pay attention to it, because the United States was and is in the business of invading countries, changing governments. The first coup that the CIA organized was in Tehran. And the second one was next year in Guatemala in 1954. So it is obvious that Americans, ordinary citizens in the United States, would remember 1979 more than 1953, because most Americans are used to United States government acting as imperialists, basically trying to take over other people's resources. But for Iran, that coup was very significant. If Shah had not returned to Iran, you would have a nationalist government in Mohammad Mossadegh's tenure. He was an old man, so he would finish his tenure, and then the probability of having a democratic government from 1953 in Iran is something that most Iranians would welcome, instead of having the Shah's regime, Savak, that was trained by the CIA and the Mossad, all the plunders of Iranian resources. I think Dr. Takeyh is a professor, a scholar of Iranian history, so he would know that one of the disputes that Iranian government, Mossadegh's government, had with the British was the idea of finding out how much oil they were taking out of Iran, because Iranians had no idea, because the British would not allow Iranian engineers or Iranian accountants or Iranian managers to get anywhere near the place that these things were calculated. And in fact, since the oil was discovered in Iran, Iranians didn't know how much these foreign governments were taking oil out until the 1979 revolution. That was the first time that Iranians found out how much oil was going out of the country. So the coup, of course, was very significant for Iran. And the takeover of the US Embassy should be looked at remembering that history. Normally, you do not take other countries' embassy. You don't take over if there are, normal relations, proper relations with the two countries. And I believe the United States missed opportunities after the revolution. The people who came into power, Bazargan's government, was not a government that was trying to implement an anti-American foreign policy. We had Ibrahim Yazdi, Dr. Yazdi, who was in the United States for many years. He, in fact, had extensive contacts with generally Democratic senators in the US Congress. And I think the United States could have normalized relations with Iran. And I think that government particularly was willing and able to forgive and forget most of the atrocities that the United States did against Iran after the coup. That was a missed opportunity. We had some people in the US, Cyrus Vance, the Secretary of State, that was interested in that approach. But Brzezinski, Zbigniew Brzezinski, Carter's national security advisor, opposed that idea. His idea was that if we normalize relations with Iran, the other American puppets in other countries would get upset that the US would just abandon the old regimes and go with the new government if something happened in their country similar to what happened in Iran. So they missed that opportunity. And if they had used that opportunity, you would not have the takeover of the US Embassy, because you would have normal relations between United States and Iran. And I'm sure Dr. Takeyh is familiar with Henry Pert, the person who was the head of Iran desk in the State Department. I think he may be alive still. He's an old man. He has this...
No, he's passed away.
He passed away. Recently?
Yeah, that's right.
Okay.
About a year ago, I would say.
A year ago, okay. He has a book, his memoirs. So he talks about coming to Iran before the takeover of the US Embassy in that memoir. It's translated into Farsi for viewers who may be easier for them to read Farsi. And he recalls this conflict between Cyrus Vance and Brzezinski over allowing the Shah to come into the United States, because there was a disagreement for that policy as well. So being in the State Department, he was sent to Iran by Secretary of State Vance to find out what happens if Shah is allowed. So he comes to Iran, he talks to Dr. Yazdi, he talks to Dr. Beheshti, Ayatollah Beheshti, who was the head of judiciary, which is uncommon. If you're head of the Iran desk, you would not do that. He met Dr. Beheshti because of the suggestion that Dr. Yazdi had, that you would tell him that you talk to these guys as well, because they have some influence outside the executive branch. And both people ask him not to do that. They tell him that we just had a revolution. People are upset about the Shah, but allowing Shah in would cause people to remember 1953. They would think that the United States is plotting against another coup. And we remember where the coup in 1953 was organized, in the US Embassy. And this is exactly what happened. Iranian students trying to prevent a repetition of what happened in 1953. So we are talking in 1980. So that's not very far from 1953. These young people, some of them even had memories when they were children. And that's how you had the takeover of the U.S. embassy. And we had this great American professor, Richard Falk, who's still alive. He's also an old man, but he's alive. He wrote
Still alive. Yes, that's right. He's still alive.
Yes. He wrote an article. He was a full professor of international law at Princeton University. So he wrote an article basically justifying how you could take over the U.S. embassy if you are Iran, which caused a lot of difficulties for him. But he was courageous enough to do that. So overall, I think the United States missed a lot of opportunities to correct mistaken policies. Having the 1979 revolution was not good for the United States. And if they had realized that earlier, they would have taken actions to make sure that the memory of the 1953 coup would not be in people's minds. They would not have allowed the Shah inside the United States. But they didn't do that.
Okay, Mr. Takeyh, what's your response?
As indicated, this is a contested history between the two sides, and they're both burdened by that history. They both burdened by their own variation of that history. And I understand collective memory is, they tend to adjudicate the past, which in a way does not allow them to move forward. I'm familiar with the episode of things happening before the hostage crisis. I'm working on a project, and I have looked at the cable traffic that Henry Preck came in, I believe it was October 1979. It was a week before the hostage crisis took place. And I have read the transcript of his discussion with Dr. Beheshti. And if you read that transcript, Dr. Beheshti spends a lot of time in that conversation talking about the fact that the United States is delayed in giving Iran the spare parts that it purchased. He goes through a lot of items. The idea of not admitting the Shah is sort of at the last line of it. It did not dominate the conversation between the two sides. It did not really dominate the conversation between Henry Prick and Dr. Yazdi either, although certainly they were not welcoming to the idea. And at that time, Bruce Langland, who was a chargé, was also accompanying Henry Prick. And actually, Bruce Langland had a meeting with Ayatollah Montazeri. And Ayatollah Montazeri, ironically enough, was one of the few members of the clerical hierarchy that personally liked Jimmy Carter. Because he would kind of view him as a Christian person and religious person and so forth. Why the embassy was taken over, of course, is going to be debated and disputed. But its ramifications are real. And obviously, as Professor mentioned, the 1953 crisis has affected the Iranian perspective about intervention in Iran's internal affairs by an outside power, which violates its sovereignty. And that's certainly understandable. But this is a history that I think has belabored both sides and burdened them. Their inability to transcend it. The United States and American academicians and maybe Iranian academicians may never agree on what precisely provoked the 53 crisis, or was the 53 crisis, how instrumental was the CIA in the overthrow of Dr. Mossadegh's government, given the fact that there were a lot of Iranian officials at that time, including members of the clergy who were opposed to Dr. Mossadegh's policies. At the same time, the two sides may never agree, and this will be a debate, and it should be a debate. Different people have different perspectives on this issue. But this is one of those relationships where history has thwarted ability to move forward. And history is always going to be contested. And we're seeing new documentary evidence that informs and enriches us. But what I would say is we can debate the history. And I think I probably have a different perspective on this than Professor does. But that history, both sides are living their history. Both sides are too invested in their historical narrative. And that has impeded the relationship between the two sides. The United States has had difficult relationship with a lot of countries that they have managed to move forward and put the history behind them. Here, I'm specifically thinking about Vietnam. United States dropped more bombs on Vietnam than it did in all of its previous history of war up to that time. 3 million Vietnamese were killed in the Vietnam War and 57,000 Americans. But the two sides have managed to move beyond that and establish a relationship with each other today. And that actually has helped both sides come to terms with the war in a more healthy way. And I can agree on it. The American version of Vietnam is different than the Vietnamese, obviously. But that has not essentially been an impediment to moving forward. But the history between the two sides, obviously, in the Iran-United States case, as has been indicated, is a stumbling block, yes.
Mr. Takeyh, one question. How do you assess the impacts of Iran-Iraq war in deteriorating the relation between Iran and the United States?
There is no question that has a negative impact. Obviously, it was a very prolonged and devastating war for the participants, which is in this case was Iran and Iraq. And there were many in the international community and in the region, the Gulf Arab states, the Western powers, the Soviet Union, and even China, that in some way sold arms and supported the Iraq. But and of course, Iran itself was involved in that conflict in a very serious way with detrimental effect on that. That has certainly added to the problems between the two countries. It is important to recognize from one perspective that Iraq war was prolonged after 1982 primarily because of the Iranian initiative. It was Iraq had been evicted from Iran, and there was a possibility of ending that war in 1982. And I know that's a serious debate within the Iranian political society itself, especially when late Ayatollah Rafsanjani was around. This will always come up, and of course, it's indicated in Ayatollah Montazeri's memoirs and others. And I know it's a contested debate in Iran about whether it was proper for the war to go on past 1982 with all the devastations that took place. I would say few things about that war. I don't think the United States ever condoned the use of chemical attacks on the Iranians. It may not have been as vociferous in its opposition to it and condemnatory, but did not condone the use of weapons of mass destruction against Iran. And it was a costly war for both countries. But one of the reasons why the entire, really, international community was concerned about Iranian success in that war is because the revolution was perceived as a very aggressive movement and designed by the Iranian regime to export it abroad forcefully at that times, politically at others. So there was a lot of suspicion of the Iranian revolution and the idea that this was a revolution without borders and it should be exported to other countries, whether they wanted it or not. So there was a measure of Iranian imperial aspect to that. And I know it's probably viewed differently in Iran, but the fears that the Iranian revolution generated was one reason why the international community as a whole really began to support Iraq in the war that Iraq itself initiated.
Mm-hmm. Mr. Izadi, what's your response?
Yes. Everybody agrees, I think Dr. Takeyh included, that it was Iraq that attacked Iran. This was an imposed war on Iran. Under Article 51 of the UN Charter, Iran has the right to fight back, to respond. And this is what Iran did. And if it wasn't for the help of the United States, Iran would have been able to defeat Saddam's Iraq, which, when you look back to history, that would have been a good idea for the United States as well, because if Iran had done that in the 1980s, you would not have the Iraq War, you would not have more than 4,000 Americans killed in the Iraq War, you would not have George Bush invading Iraq and causing all those difficulties for the United States. And the reason Iran was not able to do that mainly was because the United States decided to help Iraq. You remember the famous video of Paul Wolfowitz that later on, let me see, it was not Paul Wolfowitz, it was, he became the Secretary of Defense. Yes, Donald Rumsfeld.
Don Rumsfeld, yeah.
Who went to Iraq, went to Baghdad, met Saddam Hussein as a special envoy by Reagan, and you had all this aid that United States provided to Iraq to make sure that Iraqis would be able to continue the war, their illegal war against Iran. There are many, many books written about how the United States helped Iraq continue that war, including intelligence help. So what you had was you would have intelligence airplanes taking pictures of Iranian troops at the border, sending those pictures to Saddam, to the Iraqi military. They would use those pictures to attack Iranian troops with chemical weapons. Of course, Americans knew what the Iraqis were doing with chemical weapons, using them illegally to attack Iranian soldiers. And then they would take pictures again of the areas that were hit, so the Iraqis could fine-tune their targeting to hit their targets in a more accurate manner. And this was another missed opportunity by the United States. There was no good reason to help Saddam Hussein, given the type of regime that he had. But the United States decided to do that. And this is something that a lot of Iranians also remember, the same way they remember the 1953 coup. We wrote this scholarly paper a couple of years ago using a State Department documents showing, there was this debate within Iran that did the US give Saddam a green light to attack Iran, to start the war, or this was an American project and Saddam was identified to conduct this project. So these are two. It's in Farsi. It's in Farsi. If you Google my name and say Chirag Sabz, which is green light, you will be able to read it. And based on the documents that we saw, the conclusion we had was that it was the latter. This was the war was an American project, and they wanted to find someone to attack Iran militarily because the Carter administration at that time realized that economic pressures, political pressures would not overthrow the Iranian government. And they planned this war and they used Saddam. They thought he would be a good candidate to engage in this war. And this is how the war started. And they waited for Saddam to succeed. And when he didn't, then the United States government started openly siding with Saddam to make sure that he can continue the war. And I think most Americans would say that that was a mistake because of what happened to Saddam and his regime later on and the difficulties that he caused for the world, including the United States afterwards. With regard to Vietnam, I think the Vietnamese have the fortune of being next door to China. The United States, a number of years ago, decided to court all the countries that were bordering China so they could pressure on China by the neighboring countries And this is how they forgot about 57,000 Americans that were killed. This is something that we normally say in Iran, that because some people think that the slogan "Death to America" is causing the United States not to engage Iran. So that if you look at history, the United States not only doesn't care about the slogans, it doesn't care about deaths, including 50,000 American soldiers. They were quite willing to forget that history, engage Vietnam to make sure that they have a base next to China so they could implement their China policy in a more effective manner. Iran is not next to China. Iran is next to Israel. Given the influence of the Israeli lobby, I don't think Iran is able to repeat the experience that Vietnam had. I wish it could, but the geography is a little bit off.
Okay. Mr. Takeyh, what's your response? And based on what you said, is the conflict fundamentally ideological? Do you frame the conflict in this way, or is it driven by geopolitical interests?
Yes, thank you.
First, for the first decades, but yes.
I would dispute the idea that the United States instigated the Iraq War. From the documentary record that I have seen, is they're quite surprised by the fact that Saddam launched the war. They did not think he would succeed. And they also thought it was a bad idea because it would in some way impede the diplomatic negotiations to release the hostages. The invasion took place in September 1980. And I would say during the Barzaghan government, one of the things that I've seen, including an article by Mark Gazarowski, a scholar of Iran in the United States, is the degree of CIA cooperation and intelligence sharing with Barzaghan government. And among the things that the Iranian government wanted to know from the United States was the state of preparation of Iraq and also what is happening in the Kurdish insurgency that was taking place. The CIA official that interacted with Iranians, one of them was George Cave, who last visited Iran in October 1979, just before the takeover. Obviously, the other one was Robert Ames, who of course died in 1983 in the bombing of the American embassy in Beirut, which was discharged by Hezbollah, and is largely to believe at the instigation of Iran. So that's the history of that. In terms of normalization of relations with Vietnam, that actually predated the idea of containing China. It really began in the mid-1990s. And it was spearheaded by John McCain, the former senator who's passed away now, who was a prisoner of war in Vietnam for 5.5 years. Now, to address your question about whether this conflict is ideological or geopolitical, I suspect it's a combination of both. There is a perception in the United States that Iran is an ideological regime. It is imbued with a certain revolutionary spirit, and the principal pillar of that revolutionary dogma is anti-Americanism and opposition to the United States. Obviously, in Iran, it would be perceived as the United States has a certain intrinsic hostility to the Iranian Revolution, whose legitimacy it has not come to terms with. So there's an ideological component of it. Both these countries, the United States and Iran, seeks to have influence beyond their borders. Beyond their borders, in case of Iran, obviously in the Middle East, in case of the United States, also in the Middle East, although that's often debated in the United States itself. So therefore, the ideological debate dovetails into geopolitical disagreements, of which there are many. So I'm not quite sure if that could be subdivided in that manner rather effectively. They do dovetail. As you recall, during the monarchy, the Shah of Iran had many aspirations in the region. Primarily, I would argue, in the Persian Gulf area, not so much in the Levant or the Arab East. I don't think he cared that much about what was happening in Syria and elsewhere. The Islamic Republic has had a more expansive imagination, and in some cases that is viewed its policies as detrimental to those of the United States. And there are, we can go down the list and name them. The Iranian intervention in the Iraq-U.S. war. It is estimated by the United States Department of Defense that 1,000 fatalities of the 4,000 killed in the Iraq war between 2003 and 2012 were caused by Iranian munitions used by Shi'i proxies and allies of Iran. Obviously, there's the issue of embassy bombing in 1983 and 241 Marines. That's viewed as being instigated by Iran through its alliance with Hezbollah. Obviously, there is Iran's intervention in the Syrian civil war, which is viewed as having prolonged that particular conflict to the detriment of the Syrian people. And today, of course, the relationship between Iran and Syria are very contested and difficult. So both sides have had interventions in the region that they would view as detrimental to other sides' interests. That's ideological. That tends to be geopolitical. Ideological disagreements rarely stop at philosophical disagreements. When it involves nation states, obviously they would play themselves out in the region. In this particular case, obviously in the Middle East.
Mr. Izadi, why do you think attempts at engagement failed during the Khatami and Rafsanjani administrations?
I think generally from 1979 until today, American officials find it difficult to accept Iran as is, accepting the 1979 revolution. You know, there is this famous saying in the United States about the dictators that the U.S. supports. The saying is that he may be a son of a bitch, but he is our son of a bitch. And they get upset when their son of a bitch is, you can, since we are speaking in English, later on when you're translating this into Farsi, you can do some editing, can use SOB if you want. So the United States has not gotten over the idea that their son of a bitch was kicked out of Iran. How do we know that? Trump talks about this every day. He wants to resolve this problem of the last 47 years. And other American officials are not as expressive as Trump is. But I think there is this ideological component of not taking the idea of losing Iran easily. If you go back to archives of Washington Post, on the first anniversary of the Islamic Revolution, Washington Post had this series with the title, "Who Lost Iran?" If you are an Iranian and you look at that title, you would feel that the people who wrote that think that Iran belonged to them and they were looking for the responsible person or people who lost Iran. And I think that would be if there's going to be any normalization of relations between Iran and the United States, that would be something that the U.S. officials need to take, need to realize that this is what happens in some countries that you try to push around. They may have a revolution and kick you out. And accepting that as a fact and sort of coming into terms with that fact is going to help a lot. Of course, we need to remember Edward Said. There is this Orientalist mentality in many American officials, which is rooted in racism, that brown people generally should be submissive. And if they rise up and try to control their oil, then this should not be allowed. You see Trump very often talks about taking over Iranian oil. That comes from that racism, that he thinks that Iranian oil belongs to him. Why? Because he's a racist. And the United States has tried to...
What happened in that period exactly when Khatami and Rafsanjani administrations tried to start some engagements?
The late Hashemi Rafsanjani came into power after the war, towards the end of the war, and basically his presidency came after the Iran-Iraq war. He wanted to reconstruct the country. He realized with all the U.S. sanctions, of course, they were not as extensive as they are today, but with the U.S. sanctions and difficult relations with the United States, it would be more difficult to do that. So what he did was he tried to come up with some sort of a mechanism to maybe normalize relations with the United States. And he had heard about having lobbies in the United States, and he needed to find a way of having a lobby. He had realized that the Israelis have a lobby and they influence American politics extensively. And his idea was that what is it that Iran can offer the United States that the US wants? Iran doesn't have great agriculture. We don't have a lot of rain. But what Iran has, and has a lot, which is valuable, is oil and gas. So he invited major American oil companies to come and invest in Iran. And the process of giving them contracts was eased, because this was more than an economic venture. It was a political economic venture. He thought that by inviting American oil companies and they coming to Iran, enjoying Iran, benefiting and profiting from Iranian oil and gas, then they would go back to Washington and tell the politicians that, look, Iran has oil and gas. That's all they have that we are interested in, and they are working with us and they are providing access. So this was Rafsanjani's idea of maybe we can resolve U.S.-Iran relations in that manner. And this is what he did. And the American companies actually welcomed that. They came in, as he thought, his calculations was accurate. They came in, they signed contracts. And then we had this senator, I don't know if he's alive or not, maybe he is.
He's
Alphonse
alive. D'Amato.
Yes.
Yeah, he's alive.
He's alive, okay. He's from New York, Republican. Through the Israeli lobby, he provided this bill to limit the American company's presence in Iran. The Israeli lobby realized what Rafsanjani was doing. So when the first draft of that bill was published, the American companies, oil companies, objected. They said, look, you're not sanctioning Iran, you're sanctioning us. Because at that time, we had the French companies in Iran, we had the Japanese companies, we had Italian companies. Iran really didn't need the American companies. The idea was to invite them so we could normalize relations. So when the American oil companies objected, the second draft that was finally passed prevented the American companies that was done, and then gave a choice to companies of other countries that whether you take Iran or you take United States. Given the fact that the US economy is much bigger than Iranian economy, all these companies went with the United States. So the policy became a major failure, because not only it did not resolve the difficulties between Iran and the United States, it actually put the Iranian oil under sanctions. For the first time. Iranian oil was not sanctioned during the war, but it was sanctions during Rafsanjani's presidency. Maybe it would have been sanctioned later on, but he basically expedited that idea. When Khatami came into power, we had in Iran this idea that, look, we need to have projects of common interest with the United States. So when 9/11 happened in September of 2001, the United States decided to invade Afghanistan in October of 2001. And the people who believed in that idea of creating a common project, common interest, said, this is it. They said, we oppose the Taliban. The United States opposes the Taliban. And they had contacts with the Americans. Iran helped the United States in the invasion of Afghanistan extensively. There are some data that cannot be shared on how much Iran helped the U.S. because this is a public event. Mm-hmm. But the help was quite extensive, and the help continued in November of 2001, December of 2001, and you had January of 2002, President Bush going to the U.S. Congress and calling Iran a member of axis of evil, which caused a lot of difficulties in Iran because the people here expected normalization of relations, and what they got was being a member of axis of evil. That didn't work. In 2003, there was another project. We had the Swiss ambassador in Iran, doing a joint venture with Sadegh Kharrazi, who was an official in Iranian foreign ministry, and he was the foreign minister, Kamal Kharrazi, at that time, who was assassinated by the Americans a few months ago. Sadegh was his brother's son. So he had access to the foreign minister. So they said that the other idea that people in Iran had was that, look, we did the oil project, that didn't work. We did Afghanistan, that didn't work. We need to have a grand bargain. So they provided a text. The Swiss ambassador took that text to Washington, trying to start a process. If you Google Iran Grand Bargain, New York Times, the PDF of that text is available at the New York Times. They did a story and they had access to that text, so it's available online. And the US, this was the Bush administration still, did not respond. So that didn't really work out. So during the Rafsanjani presidency, Khatami presidency, there were at least 3 attempts to try to see maybe the US and Iran could get something together, and that failed. As Dr. Takeyh correctly mentioned, during the Bazargan tenure, we had the CIA trying to get in touch with some people within his administration. So the idea of Delcy Rodriguez trying to, find someone within a government and maybe trying to take over a government in that manner, that's not just Trump's idea. This is part of the American operations dating back since many years ago. So they did try to get in touch with some people within Bazargan administration, provided those people with some data to build confidence. And at the end of the day, because of the takeover of the embassy, that project ended up failing.
Okay. Mr. Takeyh, what's your assessment about this narrative?
During the period of Rafsanjani, President Rafsanjani and later President Khatami, There were efforts to move the relationship forward. They were sporadic and overwhelmed by events. I would start out by a point of agreement. I would say that the Americans, for too often and too long, have believed they could condition outcomes in other countries, perhaps Iran, which is why "Who Lost Iran" headline that was mentioned is rather spurious, because throughout that time, the Iranians were control of their own country and therefore control of their own destiny. And I would argue that was the case in 53. There's been an exaggeration of American influence in Iran by the Americans, and when it's suitable, by the Iranians themselves. There's another debate in this country, or was, about whether Jimmy Carter was responsible for collapse of the monarchy. And many of Iranian exile community tend to blame Jimmy Carter for essentially facilitating the collapse of the Pahlavi dynasty. That is completely wrong. But there is a perception in both countries that the United States has exaggerated influence in Iran itself. The Americans have that, and at least the Iranians do when the narrative succeeds. For instance, I don't think the Iranians would argue that the revolution in 1979 succeeded because Jimmy Carter undermined the Shah. They would argue it succeeded because it has mass support across social classes, and the Shah's regime could not sustain itself of power. So they attribute the success of the revolution to Iranian agency. Well, the Iranians have been in control of their country for many episodes that they tend to attribute to the United States and outside powers as well when convenient. I would argue that one of the reasons why I think the possibility of rapprochement, which really was maybe more real during the Khatami period than Rafsanjani, President Khatami period, was because there was a perception that the Iranian regime could not arrive at consensus on critical positions internally, that the Iranian regime was too divided in terms of how it wished to proceed. That's why they proceed incrementally, cautiously, and ultimately unsuccessful. Throughout the period that President Khatami may have contemplated some opening to Iran, there were many within the Iranian political system, including the late leader Ali Khamenei, who were opposed to it. And that obviously makes a difference. The other thing I would say is the resolution of conflict between Israel and its neighbors. At some point, it was neighbors such as Egypt, and later on, it became the Palestinian issue. That has been a very important objective of various American presidents. And it's always been viewed that Iran has done everything it can to prevent a normalization of agreement between Palestinians and the Iranians. Now, you can make a case that Israeli and Palestinians do a fine job at preventing an agreement among themselves, so they don't need any help. But in that sense, a core objective of the United States has been thwarted to some extent by Iranian machinations, or so it is perceived. The other issue that we have to discuss is the issue of terrorism. Iran has been viewed in the United States really since the late 1980s annually by the State Department as one of the most important sponsors of terrorism. And here we probably will have a disagreement about what constitutes a terrorist organization. From the American perspective, Hezbollah fits that bill. Obviously, from the Iranians, it does not. So there's a disagreement between what constitutes terrorism, but that also is a factor. And of course, we haven't touched on the nuclear issue, but that's another issue that has caused divide. I think to look for a grand bargain between the two sides is overly optimistic, and maybe that's one of the reasons why previous efforts have failed. I think it's possible, and I'm not sure if it's possible today, but it's possible in the past to arrive at some small-scale agreements on issues that the two sides may agree on without anticipating a larger normalization of relations between the two sides. I really don't think since 1979 important actors within Iran. First, it was Ayatollah Khomeini, and later Ayatollah Khamenei, and today perhaps his son, Ayatollah Mujtaba Khamenei, wanted to have normalized relations with the United States, because certainly the late Ali Khamenei viewed the United States as a source of cultural threat to the Iranian public. He was very clear about that in his many speeches. He was concerned about the Iranian young people being seduced by the American culture. So the idea of American presence in Iran was inconsistent with his perception of revolution and its purity and its longevity. I would argue that Iranian revolution, like most revolution, and Iranian revolutionaries, like most revolutionaries, need an antagonist, need somebody, a foil, need somebody to measure themselves against. And the United States has fit that part in the Iranian approach. I don't think we should dismiss anti-Americanism as an important and enduring pillar of the Iranian revolution since 1979. Certainly, Imam Khomeini talked about American system and Americans in quite uncompromising ways, and that has been one of the principal legacies of the Iranian revolution. Anti-Americanism. It's difficult to transcend that and arrive at some normalization of relations. I don't believe that in the 79 to today, many important figures within Iran, probably the most important figures, wanted a normalization of relations between the two countries. Ayatollah Rafsanjani obviously passed away, I believe it was in 2017. President Mohammad Khatami is still alive and is under a variety of restrictions in terms of his conduct and movement in Iran. For instance, he's not, I believe, allowed to travel abroad. So that entire reform movement that he spearheaded has to some extent petered out, as has been indicated. Outside pages of Sharq newspaper, I'm not sure if they have that much leeway in the Iranian body politic. So there is a narrative of a revolutionary regime that requires an American antagonist to justify itself to itself. And its legitimacy, to a large extent, is predicated on its anti-American credentials and dispositions. Obviously, there are many events recently that have added to that narrative of grievance and opposition.
Okay. Mr. Izadi, what's your response?
I would do a little correction, or at least provide this other perspective, that we have anti-American policy and not anti-Americanism. We have a lot of students going to the United States, studying, coming back. I think this became a famous statement that in President Khatami's cabinet, you had more American PhDs than the American cabinet at that time. The history of Iran-US relations obviously dates back to before 1953. But the problems, at least from the perspective of Iranians, comes from US foreign policy. And the fact that the United States government has managed to miss opportunities to have a normal relations with Iran. They didn't have to engage in a coup. You remember that Mohammad Mossadegh went to the United States for a few months trying to court the Americans to help him in his fight with the British, which may look foolish now, but he actually thought that maybe he can get the Americans on his side. They didn't have to support the Shah in that manner that they did, plundering Iranian resources. After the Vietnam War, especially, the American military industrial complex had problems with overproducing military equipment because the Vietnam War was not using it since it was over. And Iran became the #1 country in terms of purchasing American military products to help American companies have a soft landing in terms of production of military equipment. Iran was #1 in two things. One, in terms of how much military equipment Iran was buying from the United States. And Iran also was number one on the number of tortures that the Shah was doing using the instruction that he got from the CIA and Mossad. That was an opportunity that they missed. They could have told the Shah to slow down, correct course, so he doesn't have to run away from the country again. Instead of doing that, they decided to support Shah in the manner that they did. They could basically change course when they realized that the Shah was not going to survive. And as Dr. Takeyh correctly said, they supported the Shah until the last day of his administration. And this is the accurate history. The monarchists in Los Angeles are blaming Carter. They don't like the Democrats even today. But the reality is that Carter supported the Shah until the last minute. That was a missed opportunity. They could correct course with the Bazagan administration. They missed that. They didn't have to let the Shah in. They decided to do that. They didn't need to support Saddam during the war. They missed that. When Rafsanjani came in, they could, Clinton could veto that bill that was passed in the US Congress. But Clinton was very much on board with that policy. He did not really object. Bush could accept the fact that Iran was trying to resolve issues, especially after the help that the US got. James Dobbins, I think he is alive. He's not that old. He's
passed away.
He passed away.
He passed away.
Okay.
Yeah. About I would say maybe 2 years ago.
2 years ago. Okay. He was. Yeah. He passed young. He wasn't that old. He's the first U.S. ambassador in Afghanistan after the Taliban, and he has written this many times that if it wasn't for Iran's help, the U.S. would have had problems in Afghanistan. They missed that. And as you go forward, the other presidents, Rouhani, even Ahmadinejad's second term, the talks between Iran and the United States in Oman started during Ahmadinejad's tenure under the direction of Ayatollah Khamenei. And the other instances, what we had during Rafsanjani's term, what we had during Khatami's term, under Iran's system of governance, when you're creating a project to normalize relations with the United States, that needs the approval of the country's leader. It doesn't happen in secret. And the fact that
what about Grand Bargain?
Grand Bargain, it failed at the initial stage. So I'm not sure whether it got far enough to get the approval of the leader of the country. If it had gone further, the U.S. government actually punished the Swiss ambassador through the Swiss Foreign Ministry. They were upset that he's getting himself involved in the matters that he should not enter. So overall, I think when you look at the history of the United States-Iran relations, you see the Iranian side trying to resolve issues with the support of the country's leader. Of course, we are talking about before this war.
Yes.
The war is going to change things. And the United States not really interested in a serious manner.
Mr. Takeyh, one question about JCPOA. Why did JCPOA fail and maximum pressure begin? And who bears the responsibility?
The Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action that was agreed to in July of 2015, I believe, was a very controversial arms control agreement in the United States. Many critics of that particular agreement perceived that conceding Iran the right to enrich and stipulating that after passage of time, that enrichment would be industrialized was too permissive. They contested its inspection provisions. They contested its sanctions relief and the scope of it. It was a very controversial agreement. Obviously, I was here in July 2015, and it proved enormously controversial. One of the things that the Obama administration did not do was to establish some sort of a domestic consensus behind the agreement. Maybe that would be impossible to do, and they would argue that it would be impossible to do that. But I think their perception was if the agreement has international validity, and the agreement was affirmed by the United Nations Security Council in a unanimous vote, I believe, that if the agreement had international credibility, then it would not be subject to domestic challenges, and those domestic challenges would eventually fade away. That was a mistake. It became a sort of an article of fate in the Republican administration that should they come to power, they would abrogate the agreement and renegotiate a better one. The second mistake that the Obama administration made is not to submit that agreement as a treaty, whereby it would be voted by the Senate and therefore it would have more credibility and possibly longevity. Obviously, that the Obama people would argue that they could not do that because there weren't enough votes. So there was no domestic consensus in the United States. There was no bipartisan support for it. Perhaps that would be impossible to do, but that did not exist. On the other side, I do believe the agreement was quite controversial within Iran itself. And certainly President Rouhani has talked about that, both in the memoirs that he published and in his webpage of the news. He has periodically talked about the fact that how difficult it was and how contested that agreement was within Iran. So neither presidents, President Rouhani or President Obama, managed to craft a domestic consensus in their own country behind an agreement that would ensure its longevity. And of course, the agreement was abrogated. I believe it was in May 2019, or maybe earlier, by President Trump. And of course, the agreement no longer really exists as a viable mechanism. The other side of it was there was a perception, perhaps in the United States, that an arms control agreement would lessen Iran's behavior or diminish Iran's behavior in other areas of concern, its sponsorship of various militias and terrorist groups abroad and so forth. That didn't happen. And of course, from the Iranian side, they would argue that the economic dividends that were pledged in the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action never came, that were not delivered. So both sides have a narrative here, but I think the core issue was neither president was successful in establishing a bipartisan or a consensus behind an agreement, and therefore its collapse became almost inevitable as other areas of concern intruded into arms control. So the lesson of the JCPOA is it is very difficult to isolate arms control negotiations between the two sides and not have other areas of concern intrude into those in those discussions.
Mm-hmm. So you are in favor of a comprehensive agreement between two sides?
I think that the two sides have to be able to agree on some things, maybe not comprehensive, not just the nuclear issue, but the terrorism issue and so forth, the human rights issues now, before you can move forward. Or there has to be some improvement of behavior on all sides. And I'm sure the Iranians will have their own list of things that they will like to see the United States improve. I don't think you can have a strict technical arms control agreement between the two sides, but maybe that's just too late at this stage, given all the events of the past 2 years.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
Yeah, I generally agree. We have within the Obama administration people who did not fully came on board after JCPOA. One was Jack Lew, who was Treasury Secretary. so I think John Kerry wanted to actually implement JCPOA fully, but he was Secretary of State. Jack Lew was Secretary of Treasury, both secretaries at the same level. And I think Obama, after getting what Obama wanted, this is how JCPOA was structured, that Iran would do what Iran had to do, and then you would have verification of whether Iran has done what Iran was supposed to do, and then U.S. would implement its part of the agreement. But once United States got what U.S. wanted out of JCPOA, then implementing their part was not a priority for Obama. So we had difficulties in the Treasury Department actually truly lifting some of the sanctions. We had organizations like UANI, United Against Nuclear Iran, which is supposed to be a private entity, but when you look at the list of people on their board of advisors, their board of officers, former officials, both Republicans and Democrats, sending letters to companies and countries and officials, threatening them not to work with Iran, which was against Article 36 of JCPOA. U.S. was supposed to refrain from causing difficulties for Iran's international trade. And the reason UANI got away with that, they would say that we are a private entity, we are not government. So we had difficulties within the U.S. Congress as well. At the week after JCPOA, this is summer of 2015, you had the U.S. Congress voting to change the visa policy of businessmen who would visit Iran. Normally, there are about 30 countries that can go to the United States. Citizens of these countries can go to U.S. without needing a visa. The visa-free entry. And the law in the U.S. Congress required these people, if they visited Iran, to get a visa, which means they may not get a visa or they have to go through the process of getting a visa. So you had these things during the Obama administration. And of course, when Trump came into office, he left the agreement altogether. We had the Rouhani administration not leaving the agreement for about more than a year after the U.S. did, trying to see if they can get the U.S. back on the agreement. They were thinking about a European JCPOA. They had other ideas. None of them worked out. Then when you had the 2020 election, people here were waiting for Biden to come into office, thinking that since he was Obama's vice president, he would return to the agreement. And when Biden people came in, they had this sentence, repeating this sentence, that we want a longer and a stronger agreement. A longer meaning trying to extend the time frame, sunset clauses, and stronger meaning they wanted more in terms of the quantity of what Iran was supposed to do under the initial agreement. So this made a lot of people in Iran think that the U.S. has difficulty following through with the agreements that they sign into. And that difficulty continues to be the problem up to today.
Okay. Moving on to the current situation, Mr. Takeyh. Why did the war happen, and what were the U.S. strategic objectives?
Well, there are two wars. There's a June 2025 and there's February 2026. So I imagine you're talking about the first one or the second.
Both of them.
Yeah, in June 2025, the 12-day war, there was a view that the Iranian nuclear program was moving apace, and there were concerns that the program was on the verge of being transformed to a weaponization program. And if you recall, just prior to June, Rafael Grossi of the International Atomic Energy Organization had suggested that he lacked access to Iran and cannot verify whether the program was entirely for peaceful purposes. And as I recall, around that time, maybe in May in 2025, Iran was actually censured by the IAEA Board of Directors for concerns about its non-compliance with the inspection regime. And so those were the factors that led to the military strike. If you recall, initially the military strike was conducted by the Israelis, and the first American response that was made by Secretary Rubio was that we're not involved, and this is not a dispute between the United States and Iran, but obviously Israeli and Iran issue. Once the Israeli military power succeeded far beyond the expectations, then the United States decided to get in and essentially grab some of the glory, if you would. That was President Trump's attitude. He likes to join enterprises that appear to be successful. And the 12-day war, from the perspective of the Israelis and I think the Americans, was successful in a sense that it certainly caused very significant, if not detrimental damage to the Iranian nuclear infrastructure, whether it's Natanz, whether it's Fordo, whether it's the Isfahan conversion facility, and so forth. February 2026 war was a little more interesting and a little more perplexing, I would say. Number of events took place. First of all, I should backstop. For the Israelis, the June 2025 was not an end point. It's just another point in a larger continuum. They obviously understood from their perspective that they would have to use force against Iran again, and their concern was if the Iranian conventional capabilities recover, then the nuclear program would be reconstituted. So the war, from the Israeli perspective, was inevitable that there would be another campaign, and they seem to have been concerned about the speed of Iranian missile reconstitution. For the United States, it's a little more difficult to understand why it participated in the February 2026 war, but there were a number of reasons that propelled President Trump to do so. Quite possibly, there were the wrong reasons. The first was the American military success in Venezuela, where the United States successfully removed President Maduro. And so there was confidence in the American military ability to condition outcomes in countries in very difficult situations. So there was that. Second of all, as you know, there was an uprising in Iran in January, December, and that uprising caused considerable loss of life. The figures are disputed, as all these figures tend to be. The figure that President Trump likes to cite is that the Iranian regime killed about 30,000 to 40,000 of its protesters. Some of the more reputable human rights groups put that number of fatalities at about 7,000. That's a lot of people. So there was a perception that the regime was difficulty maintaining control. And then came the Israeli perception that if you engage another massive campaign of leadership decapitation, then you may see the Islamic Republic collapse. And that's where you saw the bombing campaign began in February 28th on the leader's compound. He was the first person to be killed, and then the campaign went on with other Iranian officials, military and civilian, including, as was mentioned before, former Foreign Minister Kharazi. So in that sense, that second war was predicated on certain mistaken judgments, I would say. The mistaken judgment was that the Iranian regime was more vulnerable to collapsing than it actually was, and the fact that the Iranian regime has a greater degree of resources and elite at its disposal that can replace the top officials that it lost. That it was more multi-layered and more rooted than initially anticipated. But also for the American perception, and you can argue misperception, the combination of success in Venezuela, the sort of international outrage, really, not just an American outrage, about the repression that took place in the months of December and January with the protests that took place. And obviously, the perception that the regime decapitation could precipitate the collapse of the government that appeared from the outside, at least, to be weaker than it turned out to be. So I think that's sort of why the two conflicts took place. They're different conflicts, obviously, but they sort of are conflated with each other. And I have to say that almost everyone, and that probably is maybe true in Iran, are impressed by the ability of the Israeli government to penetrate Iran and its intelligence services and so forth. I believe 2 ministers of intelligence have been killed by the Israelis. And usually when a foreign government has this degree of penetration of another country, that means there is a lot of dissatisfaction in the Iranian regime itself that causes this level of subversion to succeed.
Mr. Izadi, what's your assessment?
Well, I agree. The United States and Israel, and they are a team, as Trump says. So when Trump says that he's working as a team with Netanyahu, I think we should take his word for it. They thought that they can resolve that problem of the last 47 years, overthrow the Iranian government. Since Trump wants Iran's oil, and you can take his word for that as well, getting to that oil is, you can do it in a number of ways. One is doing another Bahrain, separating parts of Iran. And Trump has talked about the idea of Iranian borders not staying the same after he's done with Iran. So I think he's interested in making money. He talks about Venezuelan oil, the fact that he has made a lot of money out of Venezuelan oil, and Venezuelan oil is in Texas and Louisiana, benefiting the American treasury. He has talked about reducing national debt. It's close to $40 trillion now. So how do you do that? You don't do that in a normal way. You do it by taking over other countries' resources, Venezuela, Iran. If he is successful with Iran, he may actually go take over Greenland, as he has talked about. And they have a lot of resources as well, Greenland does. So I think Trump's primary goal was to take over Iran, change Iran's government. Israelis want to do a hegemony in this part of the world. And also they want to balkanize Iran, disintegrate Iran. And they thought that Iran is weak. It is true that Iran is weaker in comparison than to, say, 3 years ago or 4 years ago. And this is the mistake that they had. Since Iran is weaker, they thought they can get away with these attacks. Iran is weaker, but Iran is not weak, as you have seen. And Trump and Netanyahu have managed to unite Iranians more than any Iranian politician could ever do. We have this rally around the flag effect at nights. No matter where you are in Tehran or other cities, you have crowds shouting against Trump and Netanyahu. This is what Netanyahu asked Iranians to do on the first day of attacks in February. Come out in millions. They did, shouting against him. So in a way, US and Israel have actually prolonged the life of the Islamic Republic. They didn't want to do it. They wanted to overthrow the Islamic Republic. But what they have done in practice resulted in Iranians realizing that the other side is not interested in a normal relationship. They're interested in basically doing to Iran what they did. In the June war, we lost over 1,200 civilians. In February, we lost over 3,500 civilians. We have, this is a reformist government in office. So Dr. Pezeshkian, others want to see, even today, they wanted to see if they could reach an agreement. MOU was very much about this issue. But I think people within Pezeshkian's administration are also getting tired of these repeated attacks, violation of MOU. Today, Iran has realized that the Strait of Hormuz could be used as leverage against other attacks. So I think there is.
Do you think their strategies are still the same?
I think they are going to make sure that the state of we are going to have regime change, not in Tehran, but in the Strait of Hormuz. So Iran is going to make sure that there is regime change there.
What about their strategies?
Their strategy is, I think, this was a 4-year strategy. I think they are not done with the goals that they had. I don't think Trump has given up on the idea of taking over Iranian oil. We had Mike Pompeo. We like Mike Pompeo in Tehran. If Dr. Takeyh sees him in Washington, he should convey this idea to him, because he was, he talks too much. He talked about Mossad officers being on Iranian streets during the coup that we experienced. So we had all these people in the think tankistan in Washington trying to justify the attack on Iran, citing the riots. And Mike Pompeo comes and links those riots to the Mossad, which was great help for the Iranian talking points. And yesterday he is saying that he believes that the Iranian government can be overthrown. In the interview that he had yesterday, he says 100%, not 99%, 100%. So they have not given up that idea yet. I don't think they're going to succeed. Initially, Dr. Takeyh talked about a lot of people in Washington not knowing Iran the way they should, and maybe there should be more interactions and travels. I agree, especially people like him that have roots here. We realize in Gisha, he has some roots in Gisha. Initially, we talked about that. People who are genuinely interested in making sure that war is not good. You're going to have a lot of people killed. There could be other ways of resolving difficulties. As we have talked about for more than an hour, the Iranian government, at least since the Rafsanjani administration, has tried its best to see if they could avoid confronting the United States, which is a much bigger country in comparison to Iran. So the warmongers in Washington hopefully should be isolated. And one way you isolate them is you break this circle of the so-called Iran experts that are providing data that is not accurate, that is leading American politicians into quagmires, as you see unfolding now. Overall, I think the idea of changing the course of history when it comes to Iran by military intervention or coup d'etats, whether in 1953 or 2026, is not something serious.
Okay. Mr. Takeyh, are these strategies still the same in the Washington after the experience of war, and what led both sides to the MOU?
Well, I think at this particular point, I mean, it's difficult to have a clear perspective on the Trump administration because it's an administration where the president is overwhelmingly in charge and he frequently changes his position. He frequently changes his mind. So the memorandum of understanding obviously was interpreted differently by the two sides. Particularly provision number 5 about traffic through the Gulf Strait. For the Iranian regime, obviously, that meant that they would be in charge of maritime traffic by themselves. It is an international waterway, and that is not something that's condoned by international convention, by the laws of sea, but that is the position of the Iranian government, as has been indicated. For the United States, obviously, that meant some passage through the Gulf without payment to the Iranian regime was possible. And then you saw the so-called Oman corridor, where I believe that the United States Navy was escorting a number of commercial ships transiting the Gulf, and the Iranian regime obviously responded to that by targeting those facilities and that channel, and therefore we have had the situation that we have today. But it is correct that now the principal contest in the Middle East is in the Persian Gulf waters. And I think I agree with Professor when he says that the Iranian regime is very serious about imposing a new regime on the Gulf traffic, namely that using some sort of a tolling system, although it could be called different things, essentially taxing ships that go in and out of Gulf for commercial purposes. Now, I would imagine that money, that taxing, that toll are going to apply rather discriminatory. I don't believe, for instance, the Iranian regime will charge Chinese vessels that come and go through, but perhaps they will do so to Europeans. But the larger point is that the Persian Gulf waterways are internationally recognized waterways. They're part of the common goods. No country has a right to essentially impose its own regime on those waterways, particularly in terms of charging tolls. As I think Marco Rubio correctly said, that constitutes violation of international conventions as long as we own it. And if Iran can do so in the Persian Gulf region, then other countries will be free to do so in terms of obstructing maritime traffic through other areas. But that is a principal concern today, and I'm not quite sure how it's going to be resolved. There is some discussions between Oman and Iran at this particular point. If there is an agreement between the two sides to apportion the tolling system between themselves, I suspect that other regional countries will not agree to it, whether Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, and others who have been subject of attacks by the Iranians, by the Iranian armed forces. So how this issue resolve itself is now the principal concern, not just between the United States and Iran, but it's really between Iran and the international community, the Europeans and others as well, and the regional states, Iran's own neighbors, that actually use the Gulf for the principal export of their principal crop, which is in this case is oil. So the Iranian regime's conduct at this particular point, an attempt to renegotiate a different regime in the Gulf, is inconsistent with international law, is inconsistent with its own approach to its neighbors. But that is a path that the regime has chosen, and we'll see how it works out. I may get away with it. I don't know. I don't know what's in the Oman-Iran agreement, but we'll see.
What's your response about the Strait of Hormuz before asking other questions?
With regard to the MOU, there are differences of opinion in Iran. Some people think this was just a piece of paper written by Rubio probably, because this is what he said in the U.S. Congress. We just gave this piece of paper to the Iranians. As you know, when the negotiations started, Trump was under a lot of pressure in Washington. The illegal war against Iran is not popular with the American people. More than 2/3 oppose this war. Within the U.S. Congress, we had even some Republicans starting to vote against the war, as they did one time. So he was under political pressure. He was under economic pressure. Oil prices were quite high. So MOU was a way of taking a break for Americans and Israelis. They have some limitations with regard to ammunition that they have used. So they needed a break. And so some people think that this was a break. Some people take it more seriously. Either case...
Do you think it was a break?
I think it was a break. I don't think the U.S. government was serious about MOU, because if you're serious about something, you don't violate it right away on the first day. The MOU was respected for about 5 hours. Article 1 talks about two sides not threatening to attack each other. And we had Pete Hegseth, the Secretary of War, threatening to attack Iran 5 hours after Trump signed the agreement. So I don't think they were really serious about the articles of MOU from the first day. With regard to the Strait of Hormuz, we have two international laws that deal with this type of situation. One is the UN Convention on Law of Seas, and the other one is San Remo Manual. The San Remo Manual is with regard to the law of war when it's conducted at sea. The first one defines 12 miles of territorial waters for coastal states and 12 miles of contiguous zone, they call it. You add 12 plus 12, you get 24, and the Strait of Hormuz is 21 miles altogether. So the Strait of Hormuz is not international waters, it's not high seas. These are territorial waters of Iran and Oman, contiguous zones of Iran and Oman. And these two coastal states decide what happens in the Strait of Hormuz. United States is 11,000 kilometers away. US is not a coastal state, and we don't live in the 16th century. In the 16th century, we had the Portuguese coming and taking over the Strait of Hormuz. But this is a long time ago, and even Iranians managed to kick the Portuguese. That occupation did not last. The idea that you can use the Strait of Hormuz to refurbish these American bases in the Persian Gulf is not going to happen under the UN Convention on Law of Seas. Article 17 talks about passage, but it talks about innocent passage. And in Article 19, it defines what innocent is. Innocent in Article 19 of the UN Convention on Law of Seas is you are not threatening the security of the coastal state. So if you attack a coastal state, kill its leader, kill more than 3,500 civilians, you're obviously threatening the security of the coastal state. And this is why we are going to have regime change. Iran is not going to allow the United States to use the Strait of Hormuz for another attack at some other time. Trump is going to be president for 2.5 years. And as I said, he has not given up on the idea of overthrowing the Iranian government.
So what Iran should do?
Iran is going to make sure that the management of the Strait of Hormuz is going to stay with Iran. And Iran may have some fees for services, learning that from countries like Australia, like Canada, like Denmark. These are all members of the UN Convention on Law of Seas, and they charge fees, mandatory fees, not voluntary. We have Turkey that charges fees as well. They're not a member of the UN Convention on Law of Seas, and they call it passage fees. They don't call it service fees. Iran is not a member of the UN Convention of Seas, neither is the United States. So charging fees, especially if you call it service fees, is totally legal under international law. And this is one way of exercising control. And this is what Iran is going to make sure to do, because Iranian leaders want to use the Strait of Hormuz as a way of protecting the country. When Trump looks at Iran policy, he looks at Iran as some talking point, legacy issue. You don't get American citizens killed in thousands. You don't have United States territory bombed. So this war for Iran is a war of existence. Iran is fighting for Iran. The United States is fighting to have some U.S. president having a longer resume when he's finishing his term. So that's why Iranians are going to be much more serious about the end of this war and the future of this war.
How do you assess Washington's response?
Washington's response is confused. They obviously failed. They thought that the Iranian government would be finished by now. That's not going to happen. So this is a choice that Trump has, whether he wants to do America first or Israel first. If he wants to do America first, he would declare victory and then go over and take over Greenland. That's what he would do. Take over Cuba or do other mischief. Canada maybe. If he wants to do Israel first, he will continue with Netanyahu and then continue this war. And that's the best way he can make sure that his legacy is going to be destroyed.
Okay. Mr. Takeyh, having the possibility of escalation in the region, how can both sides avoid a wider war targeting critical infrastructure? Can the threat of attacks on regional infrastructure create deterrence, or would it increase the risk of escalation?
Well, this is the problem with this particular conflict that we are seeing in the Persian Gulf today, is the possibility of both sides trying to put pressure on each other in order to resolve it according to their preferences. One of the ways that the United States may try to pressure Iran in the Gulf waters is by beginning to expand the list of military targets, or as was mentioned, civilian targets within territorial Iran. That could be bridges, that could be water treatment plants, that could be electricity plants. This is a way of escalating pressure in order to change Iranian behavior in the Gulf. I don't know if that's legal or illegal. I just think that's unwise. Because it does create a possibility of a larger humanitarian problem for the Iranian people that are already stressed. Tehran seems, from what I hear, is running out of water already. There are electricity shortages throughout the country already. So the life of the average Iranians is likely to be worse. But this is the problem with the escalatory dynamic when both sides are trying to use force in order to compel a change of behavior. So that's a real possibility on the American side. On the Iranian side, obviously, the escalation would be targeting the regional infrastructure in terms of oil and gas, which further stresses the global economy. And I don't know if that will change the determination of the local states or the Iranian regime, because when you continually escalate, you essentially providing justification for further escalation. Let's say there's some sort of an American military strike against Iranian electricity grid, and Iran responds by attacking American bases, killing 50, 60 American military personnel. No American president can afford not to respond aggressively to that level of fatalities. So you begin to see how that dynamic keeps moving up. It's a very dangerous dynamic when both sides are trying to use incremental escalation to change each other's political calculation. Because at every step of escalation, a justification is provided for further intensification of the conflict, as opposed to having some kind of an off-ramp. In essence, the conflict itself becomes a justification of further expansion of it. This is the dangerous precipice that we may be on at this point. Both sides, I would say, is true about Iran, and I think it's true about the United States, have an interest in bringing this conflict to some kind of an end, in some kind of an off-ramp, maybe similar to memorandum of understanding. It is possible that whatever is being negotiated between Oman and Iran will provide that pathway out of that conflict. But I do think that the idea of imposing tolls over maritime passage, and I think the international law of this is obviously contested, will be something that is going to be a problem for the larger international community. This is why it's hard to see a way out. One of the things I will say about the Israeli government is the only actor in this, whether it's the United States, Iran, Europeans, Chinese, Russians, is the only country that doesn't care about the passage through the Gulf. They don't find the existing situation in the Gulf unsatisfactory. So in that sense, I don't think the Israeli government has much of a role in here. They would have a problem with a memorandum of understanding type of an agreement, which they would feel, not without some justification, as advantageous to Iran. But the status quo in the Gulf is not unacceptable to the Israelis, and is actually, compared to alternatives, is preferable. Obviously, the Israelis would like to have a further escalation of military conflict in Iran, targeting its resources and its infrastructure. But the current situation, I don't think, is part of an American-Israeli plan, because the Israelis don't find the passage of the Gulf being thwarted objectionable. The Americans do, for obvious reasons about the global energy prices.
What's your response?
About
the possibility of war widening to hitting infrastructure in the region and Iran.
As we speak, we have this news of the Iranian Secretary of National Security Council changing. Mr. Mohsen Rezai apparently is taking over. It's not official yet, but this is widely reported. Who's more hawkish than the Mr. Zolghadr, the previous secretary. There are people
So there would be some changes in the strategies.
It could be. There are people who are getting tired. Attacking Iran is becoming normal now, and we remember what happened in Gaza today. If Israelis don't attack Gaza, that's news. Attacking Gaza on daily basis, weekly basis, that's normal now. There are a lot of people within Iran that don't want the same experience as people in Gaza. Attacking Iran becoming normal. The other side killed Iran's leaders, killed a lot of officials, killed a lot of people, attacked a lot of infrastructure. And I think it was difficult for a lot of Iranian officials to go and sit down with J.D. Vance, the person who was part of the team. But they did that in order to resolve this issue diplomatically. And since we have a reformist government in place, they're always interested in negotiating with the United States. But even these people are getting tired. One option that Iran has is to go back and think why Trump was interested in attacking Iran. If he realizes that Iranian oil is not available, and the oil and gas in this part of the world may not be available to the international markets if this war continues, because one option Iran has is to do to other facilities in the Persian Gulf, do the same thing that Iran did with the Qatari gas fields, fixing that field. Iran hit that gas field after Israelis attacked Asaliye. fixing that field would take about 4 years. 4 years. One option Iran has is the nuclear option, basically. Making a list of all these oil facilities and telling the other side that, look, we are tired of these continuous attacks. The June attack was illegal. February attack was illegal. Other attacks were illegal. Iran is not going to continue this process. We had this MOU. You are not doing the MOU anymore. You say it's over. And that's an option that Iran has to make sure, the American economy would face serious difficulties if you have oil prices over $100, $120 for over 2 years. So when Trump is thinking about his legacy, one option he has is to have the Iranian government overthrown, which is not going to happen. The other option that he has is to repeat Herbert Hoover, destroy American economy, and he can do that if he continues this war, and give that option to Trump. There are a lot of people who are saying that we cannot continue with this attack. You attack Iran, you take a break, then you attack Iran again.
Yes.
And maybe in the process, you want to do another riots in the middle with all the economic pressure that Iranians are facing. And we have these midterm elections in November. There are a lot of people that think that if Republicans keep the US Congress, then Trump will be emboldened to continue this policy. Even if the Republicans lose the House with a small margin, you can find enough Democrats to continue funding the war, because it's at the end of the day, the US Congress who should be funding the war. So there's this window of opportunity, 2-3 months, to make sure that there is a change of policy in Washington, not continuation of this attacks on Iran for the next 2.5 years.
Okay. Mr. Takeyh, how do you assess this reasoning? What would be Trump's response to this strategy?
To the strategy of
Proposed by
Iranian
Mr.
escalation to the disabling of the oil infrastructure in the region. Okay. Well, that would, as mentioned, create extraordinary economic problems for the region itself. All these countries, of course, depend on export of oil. I think it will certainly estrange Iran from the international community. The Europeans require access to it, as do Chinese. They have managed to tap into the extraordinary reserve, but whether that will be sustainable. So it'll create global economic pressures on all countries, including the United States. I suspect the United States can withstand that pressure better than other countries, but that doesn't mean that the economy will not be damaged in a manner. It's already showing signs of weakness in other areas. I suspect once Iran takes that option and destroys the infrastructure of oil infrastructure in Saudi Arabia and Kuwait and other places, it has no further cards to play. Then I suspect the retaliation of the international community, the retaliation of the United States, can be as extensive as it wants to be, because that's the card you only play once. And once you play, it's an exhausted, perishable commodity. You can't destroy Aramco oil facilities twice if you already did it once. So I think the deterrence and leverage that Iran maintains at this point, because of its influence and control in the Gulf, will likely to be diminished to the point of being exhausted all itself. So the argument for restraint in terms of retaliation is not going to be a very powerful one. It's not going to be a very strong one. What would happen if the Iranian civilian electricity grid is damaged quite substantially? What would be the Iranian response to that? They already gone, as was mentioned, to the nuclear option. What would happen if the water treatment plants? What would happen if Kharg Island is taken over and essentially even occupied by American military personnel? What would happen? So the argument for an outright comprehensive escalation of the bombing will be more compelling and less costly to those conducting the bombings. I think that would be a catastrophic situation for everybody in the region. Obviously, the countries whose oil infrastructure was destroyed, and it could be a long time for it to be rehabilitated, will be affected by it. The global economy will be depressed. And the Iranian infrastructure will be very damaged and possibly irreparably damaged, which obviously doesn't serve the interest and the benefit and the livelihood and longevity of 87 million people. I think that was recently reported. So it is not a situation that anybody should want to be in, but that may be a situation we end up being in, unfortunately and catastrophically.
Sorry to interrupt, Mr. Takeyh. Consider such an option as a credible threat, not as an action. Would it
Yes,
be deterrent?
Yeah, I think it already has had its deterrence effect. But the problem is going to be, what if somebody calls that bluff? That's going to be the problem. But I think as currently, Iran's control in the Gulf does provide a leverage, and it does provide a measure of deterrence. So as a strategy of deterrence, it has not been without its successes. This is why I think it would behoove the Iranian policymakers at this point, and I guess there's some shift taking place in the top pyramid of that. Mohsen Rezaei has been around for a long time. I would think Iran would need some fresh thinking at this point, not somebody like that, but that's the decision of the Iranian national security establishment, and I guess he's the appointee of the leader, so it would be whatever processes they went through. But I think playing this card for too long may diminish its deterrent value. At some point, like in a game of poker, you should cash in your chips.
The other option is continuation of what we have witnessed in the last year. And there are a lot of people in Iran that believe that the cost to the United States has been manageable for the United States in terms of number of American soldiers killed, not that much. The cost was not significant enough. In terms of the U.S. economy, there was some cost, but the oil prices are now less than $80. So the cost to the U.S. economy is diminishing. And the belief is that when you're dealing with people like Trump, unless there is substantial cost, this policy will continue. Mm-hmm. So the idea is to change U.S. policy. For the first 46 years of the Islamic Republic, we didn't have the United States attacking Iran in this manner. So we need to go back to what we had normally in terms of Iran-US relations, United States not attacking Iran. Mm-hmm. The attacks have happened for the last year or so. Why? Because Trump thought that it's going to be easy. The cost is going to be manageable. So one option that Iranian leaders have is to increase the cost. And it's my belief.
What about the possibility that this threat considered as a bluff?
It depends on the Iranian leadership. If this National Security Council with the new secretary actually reaches this conclusion, the United States and Israel has enough methods of espionage to find that out. They would know that, and it would be that the Iranians are seriously thinking destroying Trump's presidency. Because, as Dr. Takeyh said, that would put a lot of pressure on the world economy and also the United States economy. And you give Trump that option, whether you want to see the rest of your presidency destroyed because you are responsible for this mess that you created, or you want to actually use this exit ramp that you signed and actually implementing that. And I believe if you give that option to Trump, Trump would realize that attacking Iran was not a good idea to start with. And then he will change course. You will have change of policy. And this is what Iran wants, change of policy.
Mr. Takeyh, as my final question, if the current strategies continue by both sides, what are the most likely scenarios for Iran-US conflict? And what are your final remarks to conclude the session?
I would say if the strategy of incremental pressure continues, there is a possibility of this getting out of hand with all the negative consequences that have been mentioned for all the parties involved, including the United States, certainly Iran, and certainly the regional states. There is a possibility of, as this conflict escalates, some kind of an off-ramp suggesting itself, whether it's to mediation efforts of Pakistan or whether it's through the mediation efforts of Oman or something to that effect. That is certainly a possibility. Maybe cooler heads preserve, maybe that will happen as well. So this is a very dangerous situation. I would say one thing, and I do agree with Professor Izadi about the fact that there was a level of concern within Iran that they got bombed in June and they got bombed in February, and that reality has to change. That cycle has to be broken. I do think that's on the mind of the Iranian officials, quite naturally. I also must be a very discombobulating experience to have so many of officials that were in charge having been killed. Ali Khamenei was in charge for 37 years. For him not to be there, I imagine that creates some degree of confusion within the political system. Ali Larijani and many others. However, I think what has happened in the Gulf has actually brought that cycle to an end. I don't think that there's much appetite for using force against Iran again, given the situation that has developed in the Gulf. So in one sense, Iran has succeeded in restoring deterrence and preventing the cycle of being bombed again. Now, it would be wise for the Iranian leaders to, as we say, take the win and try to negotiate some kind of an arrangement for the Gulf traffic that would be acceptable to the larger international community. So I would say that reality that the cycle of bombing has to end may have already been achieved if this situation can be resolved to some sort of a diplomatic compact. If it continues, then I suspect the next round of attacks by both sides against each other are going to be much more explosive and inflammatory.
One short question: how Iranians can make sure that such a change happen in Washington?
I think it has already happened, but what the Iranian regime would be wise to do is to negotiate some kind of an agreement for free passage of maritime commercial traffic through the Gulf.
Okay. Your final remarks.
These are very difficult times that Iran is going through, unjustly. Attacking other countries, killing their people, attacking their infrastructure. These are not normal things. We are not dealing with normal people. We are dealing with people that are willing to kill thousands of people in order to add another line to their legacy. And because of that fact, engaging them in rational manners may not be a good idea, because you become predictable, and then they can continue the mayhem that they have created. So there are a lot of people here that believe that the Iranian government has been too nice to the United States because their response has been quite measured and maybe not enough. How do we know that? Because they continue the attacks and pressures on Iran. So we need to see a change of policy within the next 2 or 3 months. And the question that you had is that how do we know a change of policy has occurred? Trump can declare victory today. He can declare victory today. And he was about to declare victory, and he did a few months ago, and then he, probably from pressure from the Israelis, he changed his mind and he continued these type of attacks. But unless the US government realizes that this has been a mistaken policy, there's a good chance that this policy will continue until Trump is president. And that's too long for Iran to tolerate.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Mr. Takeyh, for your time, for your contribution to this discussion, and have a good day.